Well, good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the University of Glasgow for our Adam Smith 300 tercentenary Symposium. I'm Graham Roy, and I'm the Dean of External Engagement here at the University of Glasgow in the College of Social Sciences, and also a Professor of Economics in the Adam Smith Business School. And today is the centrepiece of the university's commemorations to mark the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith. Now, we've got a great set of activities for you, and we're looking forward to spending the day with you. I'm delighted to have notable scholars of the Scottish Enlightenment in law, philosophy and history. And Craig Smith, in particular, is one of those fantastic scholars that we have at the University of Glasgow. He's the principal investigator on the Adam Smith 300 tercentenary John Templeton Foundation grant, and he's a world-renowned scholar on Smith. He was educated at the Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh and taught in the Department of Moral Philosophy at the University of St Andrews before taking up his appointment here. He's the author of several books on Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment, and his 2020 book on Adam Smith provides a fantastic overview of Smith and his full range of thinking. He was one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook of Adam Smith, and he's the incoming editor of the Adam Smith Review. He's also got his, to use a Glaswegian phrase, his bonny face plastered over virtually every video screen that we have at the university, and he's been an absolutely fantastic ambassador for the Adam Smith tercentenary. Craig's going to kick things off with some reflections on Adam Smith, the boy and the man. Can you please join me in welcoming Dr. Craig Smith?
It's a wonderful introduction. As Graham said, I'm the Adam Smith lecturer in the Scottish Enlightenment here at Glasgow, and to be an Adam Smith scholar, but to be an Adam Smith scholar here has always been a wonderful thing to be. And more so when you think about the fact that Smith is, especially now, somebody who is thought about and talked about as part of the public discourse, is somebody who people are interested in and who write to the university and write to me and ask questions about Smith. And that's always been a really enjoyable part of working on Adam Smith at his academic home. But when we were talking about what we would do today and how we would set this up, I thought a nice way to start, without kind of prejudging where the conversations might go, would be to think a bit about Smith and what we think of him and who we think he was. So in a sense, why are we here to commemorate him? Because a commemoration is slightly unusual. It's not like a eulogy. We didn't know the man during his lifetime. But with Adam Smith, we all do think we know him. We know Adam Smith, this featureless, this character, this person who's associated with so much fine academic work. So when I started to think about what you would do when you would commemorate somebody, I decided that the easiest way to do this, being a good academic, was to do some research on commemorations of Adam Smith in the past. And so I had a look at some of the previous commemorations for significant anniversaries and some of his biographies to see what others made of him. So I went back and I looked at what his friends like John Miller and Dugald Stewart said about him, the people who knew him. I went back and I looked at some of his admirers like R.B. Haldane, F.W. Hurst, John Buchan and Jesse Norman, who've written books about Adam Smith and his life. I also had a look at his academic biographers, John Ray, Ian Simpson-Ross and Nick Phillipson. And I had a look as well at some of the great tradition of Adam Smith scholars at this university that Graham alluded to, people like W.R. Scott, James Boner, Andrew Skinner, Alexander Brodie, Chris Berry. And looking at that, you get an impression of who Smith was and what he thought. Reading their work gives you an insight into his life and ideas. And so that's what I thought might be a nice way to kick off our reflections today, to ask the question, who was Adam Smith and how did we come to know him? So one way we might come to know him is through the events of his life. And that gives us a particular picture of him. The quiet son of a devoted mother and a dead father, born in the small port of Kirkcaldy in 1723, educated in the progressive fashion at the Borough School by his teacher David Miller, on to Glasgow University, as Graham said, in 1737, to the cutting-edge education of never-to-be-forgotten Francis Hutcheson and the brilliant mathematician Robert Simpson, talented scholar in languages and natural sciences, as well as moral philosophy? Can we picture him in his public examination? This was a test that the students had to pass to move between years at the university, where they had to sit in the black stone chair, which you can see upstairs in the Hunterian, which has an hourglass above the seat. And you were sat on the chair, the hourglass was turned, and then Francis Hutcheson interrogated you for an hour on a topic of your choosing. Can we picture him doing that? Does that tell us something about him and his ideas? Is he the Snell scholar, despairing of Balliol College, Oxford more generally, but using the time to read voraciously and develop his academic technique? And also, we might want to consider being able to avoid the small matter of the Jacobite rebellion by being in Oxford while that's happening further north. Is he the central figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, the freelance lecturer in Edinburgh, the protege of acid-tongued Lord Kames, the friend to genial David Hume, Joseph Black and James Hutton, the occasionally frosty rival to Adam Ferguson, his equivalent at Edinburgh University, colleague to William Cullen and to James Watt, raised to anger with John Anderson for unfairly voting for himself in a college election, teacher to John Miller, James Boswell, and many others? Is he the beloved professor at Glasgow whose students refused repayment of the fees when he left early during the term? Is he the lecturer on natural theology, on ethics, jurisprudence, politics, rhetoric, and belles lettres? Able administrator and university reformer? We know that he held the attention of his students, and he did that by picking a student in the room and watching their reaction to the lecture and using that as a way of gauging how successful he was being in holding attention. So if anybody sees me staring at them, that's exactly what's going on there. We know that he hated his students taking notes. He referred to them as scribblers. But that he also, after the lecture, later in the day, interrogated them about the content of the lecture. So you can understand why they were scribbling away, trying to record the notes, knowing that they were going to be questioned on it. Is he the person who immersed himself in the life of the city of Glasgow, discussing political economy with the tobacco lords, William Cunningham, Alexander Spears, John Glassford? Is he the clubbable man who joined the Societies of Enlightenment Scotland, stalwart of the Poker Club, not a club for cards, but for poking up the politics of the day, a group of people whom James Boswell called literary barbarians because they roasted speakers and attacked their ideas regardless of how famous or how high in rank they were? Is he the member of the Select Society, the society devoted to improvement, and in particular the improvement of Scotland, involved in a scheme to promote Scottish arts, sciences, manufactures, and agriculture, offering prizes and premiums for inventions and new discoveries to encourage the development of the country? Or is he the best-selling author, the successful author of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, quickly acclaimed around the world and translated into the major European languages, bringing him fame and renown in the academic world and beyond? Or is he the travelling tutor to the Duke of Buccleuch, spending time in France and meeting the leading Enlightenment figures, Voltaire, Turgot, Quenet? Perhaps we might want to understand some of the influences on his life by thinking about those long visits to London to see friends like Edmund Burke, Benjamin Franklin, and to socialise with celebrities like Dr. Johnson, although their relationship was frosty, one might say. Is he the advisor to politicians, lauded by all of the leading politicians of the day, advisor to the cabinet on matters of taxation and revenue? Is he the person who Hume described as zealous in American affairs in the 1760s and 1770s when he was in London? Or is he the man who settled in Edinburgh in Panmure House with his mother and his cousin Janet, entertaining the literary figures of the city and visiting notaries? Is he the Commissioner of Customs and patron of arts that he became in his later years? So all of these are details of his life that might help us understand some of the things that interest him and some of the reasons why we remember him for his ideas today. But the details of his biography only take us so far. The little snippets, though, that we have of his character are also perhaps revealing of who he was. He was apparently a very private man, somebody who was reserved in company. Some claim that he was unprepossessing of appearance, with prominent teeth and lower lip, and, if the few images of him that we have are accurate, a not inconsiderable nose. We hear that he had a smile like Christmas morning that made people like him, and also that he had a rolling gait and carried his walking stick over his shoulder like a rifle. Some contemporaries comment that despite his great works on the moral sentiments and moral character, that he himself was not a great judge of character, that he was prone to flights of fancy in conversation, of talking to himself and smiling at strangers. Perhaps otherworldly in manners, but absolutely worldly in his focus on his administrative duties at the university and in the customs office. Solitary but not retiring, cautious, modest, wearing his fame lightly, and hating a fuss. We hear of his enjoyment of solitude in Kirkcaldy and being teased by his friend David Hume for avoiding Hume's dinner parties, which is probably fair enough, as Hume was an enthusiastic but terrible chef. We hear of his love of strawberries and sugar lumps and claret and oysters, hopefully not all at the same time. His passion for books and his extraordinary memory, that he gave much of his fortune away, but also that he was so scrupulously honest that he burned his own possessions when he found that he had not paid the correct duty on them. So we learn something from the details of the life, something from the description of him as a person. But if we're to ask how we know Adam Smith and how we feel we know Adam Smith, we do that because we know his books. And it's to them, perhaps, that I should turn to set the scene for today in a little more detail. I wouldn't presume to try and summarize the breadth of his scholarship, but perhaps we might cherry pick a few things to seed today's discussion as we move forward. Let's start at the end with the principles which lead in direct philosophical inquiries illustrated by the history of astronomy, published posthumously in 1795, but probably written much earlier in his career. What does Smith do in that work? He gives us a theory of how human beings come to develop science. And his argument is that it's driven by our emotions. Wonder, surprise, and admiration stop the natural career of the imagination. And our imagination feels a real difficulty, something which drives us to anxious curiosity. When we come across something we don't understand, we want to try to understand it. And that initial emotional response that Smith talks about is the thing that drives us to develop science and philosophy. We need to understand the world for our imagination and our anxiety to be dispelled. Philosophy, he tells us, seeks the invisible chains which bind together all those disjointed objects. It endeavours to introduce order into this chaos of jarring and discordant appearances, with the goal of allaying the tumult of the imagination. Human beings have a psychological need for explanation, and we might think about that as an explanation of Smith himself. Smith was a curious person. He wanted to know how the world worked. And this attracted him to the ideas of Isaac Newton and David Hume, to empiricism and simple systematic principles that explain or help to explain the world, to causal explanations, and to making those explanations clear to his reader. And that might bring us then to another one of his works, the Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres from 1762 to 3, which we have in the form of student notes. And they show us that Smith was a literary as well as a scientific thinker. He reorganized the logic curriculum at this university from, as he saw it, useless syllogisms to more useful arguments and presentations, teaching the students how to make an argument and how to convince an audience. He was interested in style and again in imagination, in how to persuade a listener or a reader. And the way to do that, he thought, was in the plain style, to be as clear as possible, to make your ideas as accessible as possible, to persuade. Now that might, again, tell us something else about Adam Smith, that he wants us to understand the argument. He wants to lead us through what he's saying. Indeed, one of his students said that each lecture was organized in that fashion when he taught. He would start with a puzzle or with a set of propositions, and he would then try to persuade the audience of his position in response to them, becoming more and more engaged and more convinced of his own argument as he talked to the students. We might also want to consider his other lectures that we have, the lectures on jurisprudence. So again, we're fortunate enough to have student notes from 1762 to 3 and 1766, which help us see what he was talking about when he talked about jurisprudence as part of the moral philosophy lecture course. And what we find there, again, is a desire to explain how the institutions of property, law, and government arise from the interaction of human nature with the particular circumstances that people find themselves in. And the lectures are a masterclass in the use of historical evidence and in the comparative method, deploying what's come to be known as conjectural or theoretical or natural history to persuade the students of the nature of the institutions that they are there to learn about. He explains how the same problems arise in all human societies, but how different economic and political societies adopt different ways of dealing with them through time. Evidence is deployed to show us how the rise of stable property, the rule of law, and individual liberty provide a different type of society from those that went before them. But what about the big books? What about the ones we actually spend more time thinking about? What about the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations? I think it's helpful sometimes to pause before we talk about what is in those books and to think about the titles that Smith quite deliberately gave them. It is a theory of moral sentiments, and it is, to give it its full title, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. These are works of science. They are systematic, and they are based on the study of what is there. They are not books that seek to persuade us how we ought to live our life directly by argument. Instead, they tell us how morality operates and how the economy operates, and from there, then go on to persuade us of the principles that Smith believed in. These books are grounded in everyday examples, in data, in history, and they illustrate arguments in as clear and plain and convincing a fashion as Smith thought possible. According to one of his biographers, Smith united in himself two powers which do not often go together: the power of abstract thinking and that of being able to grasp facts with a keen interest in them merely as facts, unifying, if you like, the two sides of Isaiah Berlin's famous hedgehog and fox game. But for Smith, the abstract never replaces the concrete. He's abstract in his organization of these books, but the aim is to draw as much concrete evidence to support his positions. He's an observer of the world who wishes to convince his readers. And we can see that in the way that he structures these two great books, because he places two ideas at the start, one in each book. Indeed, he's so clear about this that he puts it in the first sentence of the first paragraph of each book. If we think about the theory of moral sentiments published in 1759, we find the first sentence reading, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure in seeing it." And he brings in his key explanatory principle of sympathy right there on the first page of the book. And what this shows us is that Smith is dissatisfied with existing moral philosophy, with the selfish system of Hobbes and of Mandeville, but also with the system of benevolence of his great teacher, Francis Hutcheson. And he's dissatisfied with them because he doesn't feel that they capture the experience of what it is to be a moral agent. So again, he starts from experience. He starts from this idea that if you're going to persuade people, you have to examine how they actually live and how they actually feel and build your argument up from there. And that's what he does in the book. He explains the origin of a common sense of morality, how we all experience morality, using wonderful everyday examples that bring each element of the theory home to the reader. Morality, he says, is felt. It's an emotional experience. And my favourite example, the one that I still go back to again and again from that, is that everybody knows what it feels like to tell a joke at a party and for nobody to laugh. That feeling is a universal human feeling, and Smith's use of an example allows his reader to recognise that and to think about what Smith is then going to go on to tell us about how we respond to how other people respond to us, how that shapes the beginning of us thinking about the world and their views of us. But he's doing this and he's developing these arguments while he is a professor of moral philosophy here and is involved in a moral education. So the point is not just an abstract psychological argument, it's to build up from everyday experience, from a very simple principle, a set of convincing arguments that allow his listeners and his readers to understand the world and to understand what's involved in being a moral agent. If we move on to his other great book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, we find the same rhetorical technique. Right there on page 1, paragraph 1, chapter 1, Smith starts off with his famous description of the division of labour. The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labour and the greater part of the skill, dexterity and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labour. And what we see through the rest of the book is an examination of this principle, its application to illustrate other parts of the political economy that he wants to discuss. And at the true heart of this, again, is an observation about human nature and human behaviour, an observation about the desire of bettering our condition, which exists in all human beings. And the way in which human beings pursue that through trade allows Smith to develop an understanding of specialisation and interdependence. This, just like the theory of moral sentiments, is a book about sociable human beings, about how we interact with each other. As he puts it, in a civilized society, we stand at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, while our whole life is scarce sufficient to gain the friendship of a few persons. It's that truth that leads us as human beings to develop trade as a way of interacting with people that we can't appeal to as friends and as members of our family. So again, he's drawing on a very deep observational technique to show us how human beings have responded to the problems that they face in their lives. And in doing so, he's groundbreaking. People had talked about the division of labour before Smith, but Smith is the first person to say, well, the division of labour is not itself driven by the particular natural talents of individuals. Instead, human beings, by applying themselves to different forms of education and different forms of labour, become different. They become better at that particular task. And so the diversity of different human experiences that we see, that's what drives the usefulness that we have for each other. It doesn't necessarily depend upon a natural, innate talent for any particular thing. It depends upon our ability to apply ourselves to the task that's been set before us. So we have these two great books, and that's how many of us know Smith, coming to him through these two great books. And one of the things we're hoping that we're able to do over the course of this tercentenary celebration is to persuade those who haven't already done so to read those books, to actually take the time, to take this time, the 300th anniversary, to take down that dusty copy of The Wealth of Nations that's been sitting on your shelf since you were an undergraduate, and to read it, and to enjoy reading it. I may be biased, but I always enjoy going back and reading Smith. But we also have, tantalizingly, the lost books, the books that we don't have. The book on government and politics, described as a sort of theory of history A Theory and History of Law and Government, the book on art, literature, and the evolution or development of culture. We don't have De Origine Idearum, The Origin of Ideas, which was his lost but well-received inaugural lecture when he became Professor of Logic at Glasgow. All of these were burnt by his executors on his suggestion. Because this perfectionist element in him, I think, the same aspect of his character that saw him edit and write and rewrite the two great books that he did publish, could not bear the idea of scholars poring over them. Much to the chagrin of all the Smith scholars in the room, we don't have that material. We do, of course, still hope for another set of notes to appear in an Aberdeenshire attic, as the lectures on jurisprudence did. But for his 300th, we have to think, and part of our project is thinking about what else can we learn about Smith and his ideas. And so we are studying what might be the final resource we have open to us to try and understand the evolution of his thinking. As part of this project, as Graham said, with the support of the John Templeton Foundation, we're examining the books from his personal library with colleagues at Glasgow and from the University of Tokyo who join us today. We're looking at his marginalia, trying to understand how he developed his ideas in interaction with other thinkers, and making those marginal notes and other parts of our wonderful Smith holdings in the special collections available digitally, so that scholars and people around the world can look at that material and make their own minds up about what it might help tell us about Adam Smith and his ideas. So we've got the books, and we might wish for more from the lost material. But all of that doesn't really help explain to us why so many people know the name Adam Smith and so many people recognize that name. Now, one of the biographers that I went back and looked at, F.W. Hurst, he thought that Smith possessed what he called prevision and was able to project himself into the future as he contemplated how commercial society was developing around him in Scotland. I think that might be taking things a little bit too far. I don't want to make the case for Adam Smith as a kind of clairvoyant here. But Smith is a thinker who could inspire other thinkers. And so at least part of the Adam Smith we know is the Adam Smith who inspired thinkers of the left, like Karl Marx, and thinkers of the right, like Friedrich Hayek. He's the Adam Smith who can find himself admiringly name-checked by politicians as diverse as Margaret Thatcher, Gordon Brown, Wen Jiabo, and Barack Obama. And this speaks of someone whose ideas were thought to be relevant beyond his own lifetime. What are we to make, for example, of the fact that Charles Darwin was reading the theory of moral sentiments when he was working on the theory of evolution? Or what are we to make of the neuroscientists today who are currently trying to understand the operation of mirror neurons in the human mind by reading Smith on sympathy? In turning back to his biographers in preparation for this year, I was struck by an observation by R.B. Haldane, himself a type of man we don't often see today, being both a respected philosopher and a cabinet minister. Haldane called Smith a breaker down of prejudices. What he meant by this, I suppose, was that after the Wealth of Nations, it became very much more difficult to justify self-interested policy by appealing to the prejudices of mercantilism. He did not expect the simple and obvious system of natural liberty to be realized in full, or for Britain to become a utopia overnight. But he was wise enough to see that the partial interests and national prejudices of people would stop that happening. But what he could do with his science and his philosophy and his plainly described arguments, with the drawing on evidence, using historical examples, was create a system of thought that made it very much more difficult for those partial interests to advance their desires without facing intellectual embarrassment. Ever the pragmatist, always measured, even-handed, and focused on the evidence, he saw that as a way to improvement. But I think there might be even more to this than that sense in which Haldane was using it. Yes, Smith was a questioner of vested interests, a sceptic of good intentions, who always kept one eye out for unintended consequences in our attempts to help others. But he was also the author of a theory of morality at whose heart lies a mechanism to explain conscience, to explain why we should care about others and why we should realize the real littleness of ourselves and, in a very Scottish manner, not magnify our own concerns beyond that of others. In all things, he advocated education, science, and philosophy, the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. He lived a life full of conversation and debate. And today's symposium has some wonderful speakers who have all come with a view to exploring Smith in his world and in ours. For us to have an enlightened conversation in good company. What a rather nice way to commemorate the man and to celebrate his birthday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig, for that tour de force. One of the most enjoyable things I have to say with the tercentenary commemorations is myself and colleagues being able to spend time with Craig over the last year, 18 months, and planning out the various activities and just chatting to him informally, coffee, sometimes beer, in that spirit of Scottish Enlightenment, and just getting great ideas about our plans for the tercentenary. So thank you so much, Craig. Could you please join me again in thanking Craig for his remarks? As we've heard, Smith was at Glasgow at a time of huge political and social and economic change. So to discuss Smith in his time, we've assembled a fantastic panel for you. And to chair this session, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Kathleen Riach, who's going to chair this session. Now, Kat is a professor of organisational studies at the University of Glasgow. Her original passion was music, hence you'll hear more from Kat later about what we have in store for you this afternoon, but has gone on to become a hugely respected scholar in our field, both academically and informing policy. And Kat has been a fantastic leader in the tercentenary project. So Kat, could you please welcome your participants for your panel session? Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you, Craig. Now, this panel marks the first session at the end of a week, and the week's really been an abundance of riches in talking about Smith's ideas from wealth to value to morality and also to character. So I think it's really fitting that we turn our eye to the character of Smith himself and thinking about the formative influences of Smith in his life and his times and the place where he was based. Now, when I told my children what I was doing this Saturday, they said, "Oh, so you're telling the origin story of Smith?" And they proceeded to tell me what an origin story was in children's films. And what seemed to be happening there seems to be a tendency of origin stories to be rather polemic. So you either have the heroine or you have the anti-heroine or hero. And I think really Smith's been subject to that charge as well in terms of how we think about him, and it's really been lacking a more nuanced approach in terms of the context in which Smith grew up and his intellectual influences. So what we want to do in today's panel is really provide some of the more nuanced and fascinating contextual marinade that made Smith and made his ideas when he was at Glasgow and more broadly in his life. And one of the real joys in being involved with Craig and with Graham and with Tom and the rest of the team at Glasgow in the Smith 300 project is that we're allowed to create a wish list of who we would like to hear about discussing this, kind of like an academic equivalent of the dinner party question. And we're delighted that everyone said yes. So I'm really delighted to have sitting with me 5 of the foremost authorities of Smith from around the world, who will each be speaking to different aspects of why Smith and why Glasgow. Now, you're not here to listen to me, so we've decided that I'll introduce each of them just now in the reverse order that they're speaking, and they'll hand on to each other one at a time. They've been very gracious in allowing me to address them by their first names, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with Steve here. So Steve Medema is the George Family Research Professor in the Department of Economics at Duke University and Associate Director at the Centre for the History of Political Economy, as well as a Research Associate in the School of Law. Steve's expertise focuses on the interplay between markets and government in the history of modern economic ideas and expanding boundaries of economic analysis. His ideas are explored in, I think, what is one of the best names I've heard for a Smith book, The Hesitant Hand, Taming Self-Interest in the History of Economic Ideas, which is awarded the annual book prize from the European Society of the History of Economics. More recently, Smith has worked on a very Smithian project of bringing an understanding of the history of economics to a broader audience in his most recent book, The Economics Book from Xenophone to Cryptocurrency, 250 milestones in the history of economics. And Steve will be speaking about Smith as one of what we might call one of the first public intellectuals of his time. So welcome, Steve. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Maria Pia Paganelli. She is Professor of Economics at Trinity University in the US, having read economics at George Mason University. She is an expert on the work of Adam Smith, David Hume, and 18th century monetary theories, as well as behavioural economics, evolutionary biology, and neuroeconomics. Maria is currently President-elect of the History of Economic Society and is President of the International Adam Smith Society. She has published extensively on Smith, including being the author of the Routledge Guidebook to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Adam Smith, along with Chris Berry and our own Craig Smith, which you can find at the book stand for a very reasonable price. Maria didn't ask me to say that, I should say. Maria will be providing a reflection on the club culture of Smith's time and the social dynamics around character, gender, and civilization. Thank you, Maria. Next, I'd like to welcome Mary Morgan, who is the Albert O. Hirschman Professor of History and Philosophy of Economics at the London School of Economics, behind the flowers there. Mary is a world-renowned scholar in history, philosophy and sociology of science, whose work focuses on economics and statistics, models, measurements, experiments, observations, facts and narratives. Her groundbreaking book, The World in the Model, How Economics Work and Think, explores the move from economic reasoning with words to reasoning with models as part of a naughty historical change that has brought a series of epistemological and political consequences to both economics and the world more broadly. She is a Fellow of the British Academy and is the current President-elect of the Royal Economic Society for this year and will be President next year. And Mary will be reflecting on some of the limitations and misapprehensions of Smith. Welcome, Mary. Next, we have Ryan Patrick Hanley, who is Professor of Political Science at Boston College and has held visiting positions at Yale, Harvard, and also the University of Chicago, where he read for his doctorate. Ryan's work, which encompasses 4 books and over 60 articles and chapters, focuses on Enlightenment political philosophy and includes the edited tome Adam Smith, His Life, Thought and Legacy. Ryan's recent book, titled Our Great Purpose, Adam Smith on Living a Better Life, takes Smith's idea of the excellent and praiseworthy character as a critical intervention that provides a valuable and accessible insight into Smith's work, but provokes us to consider what Smith and ourselves might consider what is to be a livable life. And Ryan will be speaking about the particular locale of Glasgow and Glasgow University as part of what he wonderfully calls Smith's Social Laboratory. So welcome, Ryan. But presenting first, I'm delighted to introduce Benjamin M. Friedman as our first speaker. Ben is the William Joseph Mayer Professor of Political Economy and formerly Chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard University, as well as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Having read economics at Harvard, Ben has published 17 books and 150 journal articles, which has led to awards such as the George S. Eccles Prize, the John R. Commons Award, and the Medal of the Italian Senate. Ben has been on the board of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, which he reminded me, of course, originated in Scotland. And he will be discussing today, by opening our session, with discussing some of the critical intellectual influences that were shaping the world at the time of Smith and his own intellectual ideas. So welcome, Ben. Now, each speaker will be providing their thoughts and reflections. We'll then go to a short fireside chat and then open the floor for some questions. So please, Ben, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, and let me thank you, and as well as the other organizers of this marvelous event, for including me. And I congratulate all of you here at the university for this wonderful event celebrating the person who, to people like me, is the father of modern Western economics, but who is so many more things as well, as we've just heard from Craig. So congratulations to all of you on this splendid event. I want to focus this morning on several of the influences that enabled Smith, and to a lesser extent his contemporaries, to come to the thinking that they had. Albert Einstein famously observed that people who think about the world and are creative in that way don't really think about the world. They form in their minds what Einstein called a Weltbild, a world image, a world view, a picture of the world, and then they analyze their image, not the real world. Why? Because the world as it exists is simply too complicated. If we don't simplify, we can't make any progress. So the question I would pose is, what were the influences that shaped the world view that Smith brought to his economics? I'll focus on three, one of which is so well known and widely discussed that we don't need to spend much time on it. A second one of which is widely discussed, but I think imperfectly understood. And then a third one of which is usually overlooked. The one that's well understood is that Smith lived in what was increasingly a commercial society. Here in Glasgow, also in Edinburgh, in London, in Paris, Smith knew and observed people who were engaged in mercantile commerce. And he talked to them, he understood their foibles, he understood the reasons for being cautious about paying attention to what they said. He understood from observation the nature of competition. And I think this is all well understood and doesn't require a lot of time this morning, but it's useful to keep in mind that Smith was an observant man who was paying attention to the world in which he lived and what was new and interesting about it from an economic perspective. The second influence, which is often discussed, but I think imperfectly understood, is that of Isaac Newton. Newton's great work, the Principia Mathematica, was published in 1687, and by the time Smith was an undergraduate here at Glasgow, the book was part of the standard curriculum in all of the Scottish universities, as well as at Cambridge, interestingly not at Oxford. Perhaps this accounts for why Oxford lagged behind Cambridge and the Scottish universities for so many years in scientific endeavor. But Smith and his generation of intellectuals were all trained in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. As Hume famously put it, the goal of his work and Smith's and others was to create a science of man comparable to what Newton had achieved for the physical universe. And I think this helps to understand the nature of Smith's contribution, especially in The Wealth of Nations. Smith was not the first person to articulate what we today have as the first fundamental welfare theorem of economics, namely that individuals acting merely on their own self-interest without any altruism or explicit regard to others can, and under the right conditions will, take actions that make other people, in addition to themselves, better off. This is a truly penetrating and remarkable thought, but Smith was not the first to get there. Pierre Nicole, for example, articulated it very clearly in an essay written in the 1670s and published in English in 1695. So why is it that we don't think of Pierre Nicole as the creator of modern Western economics? Mandeville, in a series of editions of the Fable of the Bees starting in 1705, clearly articulated the same idea. Why don't we think of Mandeville as the father of modern economics? The reason is that Nicole and Mandeville and Butler and all of these other many people Cantillon, many others who had the same idea did not understand the systematic mechanism that made it true. What they were doing was comparable to somebody's reciting a theorem but having no proof. It was Smith in The Wealth of Nations who for the first time made clear that it was markets and competition in markets that provided the crucial mechanism and therefore outlined the conditions under which the theory would be true. Now, what led Smith to this? I believe it was his and his generation's education in Newtonian aspects of system and mechanism, and I believe this is part of why The Wealth of Nations immediately became established as what Donald Winch called the fountainhead of political economy. Smith had the mechanism, he understood the systemic framework within which all this works, and I think it was the influence of Newton that enabled him to do it. The third influence I would like to mention is one that is usually overlooked, and this is one that I've emphasized in my own recent work, and it is the momentous change in thinking that was taking place at just this time in the religious thinking of the English-speaking Protestant world. I do not mean for a moment to suggest that Smith or Hume were religious individuals. We know that this wasn't true. Hume, for example, used to refer to Church of England bishops as agents of superstition. His great friend William Robertson, the principal of the university across the way, used to refer to him as a delightful heathen. It was not the effect of self-consciously, religiously committed individuals bringing their religious beliefs to bear on their economic thinking. Rather, it was that they lived in a world in which religion was more pervasive, more important, more multidimensional than anything we know in today's modern Western world. And it was just at the time when Hume and Smith were coming into young adulthood and therefore forming for themselves what Einstein would have called their worldview. It was just at this time when the revolution, to call it that, in theological thinking was reaching Scotland, This happened in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It came to Scotland in the early to mid-decades of the 18th century. It came to my country in the latter part of the 18th century, which is not incidentally related to the creation of the American Republic, but that's another story. But Smith and Hume lived in a world in which the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism was at its most controversial here. And even though I don't think they were religiously committed men, they could not help but be influenced by this great movement around them, which involved a more optimistic sense of the human character and a more expansive view of the possibility of human agency. And I think it's this more expansive view of human agency that has come down to us as the core of modern economics. If you look at any introductory course in economics, what does it start with? It's about the decisions made by individual households and individual firms. There is a sense that these decisions can, and under the right conditions do, lead people to be better off. And I think this started with the Smithian understanding and the wealth of nations and has come down to us ever since. And I think the more optimistic view of the human character and the human enterprise and what it leads to that came from Hume and Smith has been a character of economists and economics ever since. I think it was unfortunate that Carlyle 100 years later created the notion of the dismal science. That was a bad label. You could see why, coming off of half a century of Mill and Marx and Malthus, you could see why Carlyle might have said that. But it's not a characteristic that would have fit Smith or Hume, and I think it's not a characteristic that fits economics today. So we owe a lot to Adam Smith. He was the creator of our subject. I'm an economist. He was the creator of our subject. But it's not an accident that Smith came along when he did and where he did. And so in the sense that all of us as economists owe something to Smith, I think we owe a great deal to the Scotland of the 18th century in which he lived. And it's wonderful that we are here to celebrate it today. And I congratulate you and your colleagues again for putting this together. Congratulations.
Great. Thanks, Kat. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to follow Ben in this brilliant overview of Smith's Enlightenment context, and especially the challenges to Calvinism, the growth of Newtonianism, and these broad trends that Smith was undeniably shaped by. I'm going to pivot slightly and focus on the more hyper-local context that shaped him, and indeed on sort of the second part of our question, the why Glasgow, because I think that the years that Smith spent here in Glasgow were remarkably formative on him, and precisely because Glasgow was such a remarkably dynamic place in the years that he was here. And it was dynamic especially in two very precise ways: the dynamism of its economy and its intellectual dynamism that came from life here in the university. So I'm going to use my very few minutes that I have available to say just a few brief words on both fronts. So to follow from Craig's very nice opening introduction, so we know that Smith spent roughly about 17 years in total here in Glasgow, roughly 4 or so as a student, 13 as a professor, in between the period of 1737 and 1764. That, of course, includes his years in Oxford as the Snell exhibitioner. What's significant about this, to my mind, is that by being here in the second quarter of the 18th century, Smith had a remarkable front row seat to one of the most dramatic urban social transformations to be found in the entirety of the 18th century. And what drove this transformation, of course, was principally commerce, and especially trade with the American colonies. And so what Smith would have witnessed, what he did witness firsthand, of course, is the exportation of linen and woolen goods from here in Scotland, and then the return importation principally of Virginia tobacco back in to Glasgow. And I don't think that the influence of this could be overstated in how it transformed the city, bringing opulence and luxury to the city, and also elevating to new levels of political power and influence a new merchant class. What I want to emphasize in all of this, all of which is very well known, is the degree to which Smith was watching this and taking this in. And so anybody that's read the theory of moral sentiments knows that among its fundamental concepts is not just sympathy, but also spectatorship, observation, watching. And this concept that's so central to Smith's moral theory, I think was also central to Smith the man and the kind of social scientist that he wished to be. And so Smith, I think, as a spectator, was a very keen observer of life here in Glasgow. And to use the words that Kat mentioned at the outset in her kind introduction, he was very much a student of Glasgow seen as a social lab, a social laboratory. It provided Smith, Glasgow did, with just a wealth of empirical data that he could and did use in his later work. And so among other things that he would have seen and which we see reemerging in his work, living here, working in Glasgow, interacting with the tobacco merchants, would have seen the ways in which merchants act together, a major theme of the later Wealth of Nations. Smith also would have seen, while he was here, of course, the ways in which commerce can both beneficially, but also sometimes perversely transform moral norms, a major theme of his later published work in the theory of moral sentiments. And also, perhaps in my mind most interestingly, Smith would have seen the ways in which societies transform and progress. And this, I think, it really can't be overstated. The degree of modernization that happened in the mid-18th century within Glasgow. And so to give one sort of brief anecdote, the great historian Hugh Trevor Roper was fond of a particular anecdote about Hutcheson's time here. That when Hutcheson was here lecturing on Locke in 1723, one could go only 12 miles away to East Kilbride and find individuals who had never seen a wheeled cart before. And when it first arrived, as Trevor Roper says, people gathered around it as if it had been dropped from the moon. This is the sort of polarization of modernity, advanced civilization, right next to pre-modern, pre-evolved forms of civilization that would have been incredibly striking to Smith. And when we read in his lectures on jurisprudence here that he gave at the university in the 1760s, and when he talks about the progress of society, we see the degree to which I think he was influenced by what he saw and what he experienced with these polarizations here happening right in the town and on the outskirts of town. With that said, let me pivot briefly and now turn to the other side of the remarkable dynamism of this Glasgow when he experienced it, which was here now much even more locally in the university as an institution. I think the university gave Smith very unique opportunities that he would not have found as an academician in most other British universities of the age. One is, it compelled a certain breadth in his teaching. I mean, we know of the topics that he lectured on: ethics, jurisprudence, political economy, natural theology, and rhetoric. He was in some ways not just instinctively a man of the Enlightenment, but as a professional scholar and teacher, he was compelled to deal with these questions that were of great interest broadly to Enlightenment thinkers. But also, he was at an institution that encouraged this, and We often talk about Smith as a student, Smith as a professor, but he was also a university administrator. And in his administration here, we also see the degree to which he was indeed committed to Enlightenment ideals. And so I'll end by just mentioning briefly, yesterday when we had this wonderful tour of special collections here, I'm very grateful to the university librarians for showing us all these wonderful documents. But one of my very favorite was the receipts of Smith's time when he served as the university quaestor, when he was responsible for the book ordering for the university library. And among the many fascinating entries there is the entry for the 8 then extant volumes of Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, which he ordered for the university library. This is and remains one of the great symbols of the Enlightenment in terms of its textual heritage. And Smith to have been, not just to have brought this to Glasgow, to be encouraged to have actually had the university funds to bring this remarkable text to Glasgow, I think, again, attests to the real singularity of the university in Smith's time and how it became a very fertile place for his ideas to grow. So I couldn't be more delighted. It's so wonderful to be able to take part in this wonderful birthday celebration here and to have it here at this university here in the 21st century that's maintaining the legacy that he left in the 18th century. It's such a great honor and pleasure. So I'm very, very grateful to have had an opportunity to participate on this panel. Thank you.
Mary,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you. I'm not a Smith expert by any means. I'm more interested in not so much the intellectual history and the scientific history perhaps, but I'm interested in the way economists respond, or what they see in the society they live in, what they see in the economy. So I'm actually quite intrigued by the problem of why Smith, why Glasgow, why Scotland. It's not quite so evident to me that this would be the place which would break out with this kind of, all-embracing economic account of systems. I can see the system side of it, but I kind of worry that I'm missing something somehow. So when invited to talk under this column, I inquired amongst my colleagues, because I work in an economic history department, not a department on the history of what economists have thought, but a department that's concerned with the history of what's happened in the economy. And that was quite invigorating, because it revealed actually that we didn't know very much in my department about Scotland. So beavering away, trying to find out about Scotland. So what kind of an economy did Smith live in? What could he have seen as he was going around? And we've had already some very nice accounts of this. So, one context would be, okay, the political economy context, the Act of Union in 1707, that gives Scotland an access to a much larger market, of course, not just England and the islands, but the growing formal and informal British Empire, which should have been a massive stimulus to the Scottish economy, according to Smith's own theories, right, about the importance of trade. But actually, economic historians think that the Scottish economy grew really slowly, both in population terms and in industrial output terms, in growth terms, until the end of the 18th century. The big change in dynamism is actually the end of the century. That's the point when Glasgow massively expands when you look at their population figures. My colleagues in economic history will tend to focus in the 18th century on something they call the Industrious Revolution. I'm sure you all know about the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrious Revolution in their mind is a consumer-led technical change. It's not a technical change in the sense that we think of as the Industrial Revolution. It's based in the Midlands. It's not even spreading all the way across England. It's certainly not based, that Industrious Revolution, in Scotland. It's driven by a rising middle class, demand for luxury, not top end, but middle class luxury kinds of goods, lace, buckles, potteries. I mean, potteries is the great industry which grows in the Midlands and becomes the world leading producer of potteries in the 1760s, 70s, 80s. So this is not what you'd expect to find in Scotland, and not what you do find in Scotland. So this wonderful account we have with the pin factory in the picture in the encyclopedia there of the division of labour, absolutely. There's division of labour in the production of pins, which might be going into industrious revolution production. But it's not one which has high levels of technical change. That really pushes the point that Adam Smith is making, that the division of labour creates high productivity and growth of that industry through the dexterity and skill of the workforce, not because there's huge capital investment or technological change. And in the page after that wonderful description of the pin factory, there's a discussion of nails, right? So I don't think there was a pin factory anywhere now in Glasgow, but there is a nail factory in Kirkcaldy, although I don't actually know what date it's there. Pins are wires drawn out, and nails are chopped up. And there's no big technical change in either of those industries until the mid or late 19th century. So yes, division of labour, dexterity, increased output, increased productivity, but relatively not things which are part of what we think of as the Industrial Revolution. So old technologies kind of extended by the division of labour. So if it's not, if Scotland, if what Adam Smith is saying it's not something to do with technology, but it is to do with the division of labour. The other one industry that we should notice, and which has already been noticed, I think, by Ryan, is the linen industry, where Scotland completely takes over from Ireland in the production of linen, because that had been basically an Irish industry. But it's basically a cottage industry still. It's an old industry, employs large numbers of women in cottages. So again, it's not a modernized industry in the way we come to think about it from the Industrial Revolution. It's an industrious industry. It's not even, in the Scottish terms, really high quality. So it doesn't make it into the high luxury end market until the end of the 18th century, by which time it can compete with Indian cloth, which is the high-end stuff. So we come back, I think, then, for economic historians to it's not driven by this industrious revolution, so we come back to what is this commercial revolution, and what does it mean to have this commercial revolution? And Ryan's already said something about the importance of free trade and the tobacco industry. The other thing I think might be of interest here is the Act of Union is a huge advantage of being on the west coast to create this trade across the transatlantic, but particularly with the Caribbean. And this is where there's some quite interesting odd work on molasses, which is not a topic which I think appears, Craig, in any of the Adam Smith's writing, but turns out to be really important for the Glasgow port. Molasses, sugar coming in from the Caribbean, sugar refineries here in Glasgow, and associated with sugar is tea. So the middle class growth of tea drinking is associated with a massive increase in sugar production. So we do find sugar refining in Glasgow associated with the import of sugar. Molasses, rum, all sorts of aspects of molasses which are part of the growing set of consumer items, both in middle class and lower class. And in context of there, I think this is where we have a very nice little example. Again, I'm not sure that Adam Smith mentions it anywhere, but it's very much a Glasgow story about the problem of knowing how much molasses is in a barrel of stuff which comes into the port. And they're all different shapes, and it's critical to know how much stuff is in these, because in 1733, there's a duty introduced on molasses. And that's where one of these very interesting public science moments happen. Colin Maclaurin, great mathematician of the century, works out, using mathematics, how to use a simple dipstick to figure out how much molasses is left in this cask. That increases radically the amount of excise duty that is collected which has a connection back to Adam Smith's interests in, or work in, customs and excise, and as a memorial to the Honourable Council of Excise in 1735. And as a result of this new technology of measuring how much stuff there is in a flask, the civil government in Scotland pretty much solves its income problem, because there's so much collected from this one kind of duty. So we have a nice example of public science, and I think that's what I want to sort of focus on in Glasgow, is this intersection of not just political economists, intellectual history, but public science, science used to actually kind of work in the public domain, doing something quite ordinary, but actually a very complicated mathematical problem of working out how to measure something. And that, of course, comes back to this West Coast advantage. And it's perhaps also worth mentioning that merchanting and commercial activity go along, particularly in the Glasgow case in Scotland, with banking. An increase in banking, very much more so than in Edinburgh. And I believe, although I haven't been able to check this, that the Glasgow banks introduced 5 shilling and 10 shilling notes. Now, this is not solving the problem of small change, but it certainly is probably solving, if true, the problem of middle kind of change levels that a merchant might be wanting for certain kinds of things. So I think there's aspects of the commercial society that are going on here which really enforce at the Adam Smith's view of commerce driving stuff here rather than industry. And the pin factory is just sort of sitting in there, but it's not really the driver. And I think, Ryan, this is compatible in a sense with what Ryan's story about the dynamism, but it's very much this commercial dynamism based on trade and banking, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor, a great pleasure. I would like to introduce Smith as an intellectual thinker in the Scottish Enlightenment. And in particular, I would like to focus on the idea of the Scottish Enlightenment as presenting independent thinking in the sense of people that try to understand the world without being deferential to authority. And at the same time, thinking for the Scots meant thinking together. It's a social activity. So I think that there is a sentence by one historian from the University of Glasgow that I highly admire, Alexander Brodie, that summarizes this concept. One thing is to think for yourself, another is to think by yourself. And the Scots were thinking together. It was a social activity to think. And Craig, in the introduction, mentioned several clubs or societies that were present throughout Scotland. And Adam Smith was an active participant to several of these societies. The societies or clubs were intellectual locus where people would meet and discuss basically everything. They would discuss moral philosophy, the economy, commerce, the military, rhetorics, theology, law, literature, fine arts, sociology, the classics, mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, logic, geology, botany, architecture, you name it, everything was discussed and debated in these clubs. How is it possible to discuss all these different things? Well, because the approach was similar. They had a common method of inquiry, which is an experimental method. And they had a common object of inquiry, which is nature. So in this context, man becomes a part of nature, like any rocks, any plants, or any animals. And this is why, as Ben mentioned earlier, we have the opportunity to develop either a science of man, as Hume called it, or a science of human nature, as Smith called it. So you're looking for regularities in human natures, in human behaviors. And you are able to discover those regularities through observations. So history becomes a laboratory to observe human behavior. It's not an accident that Smith has a very large amount of history books in his private collection. If you think of man as part of nature, then human nature has to be fixed. And you need to find what is the core of human nature and what is instead contingent, which they usually thought character would be contingent. So humans are now classified like, again, any other rocks, any other animals, or any other plants. And humans are part of a class of mammals and the order of primates. Human nature, it has to be fixed. But the problem is that there's a lot of diversity among different individuals. So the question is, how many human natures do we have? And the general approach was that we either have several different kinds of human nature or one. A monogenistic approach is that we all come from a single original stock. And a polygenism approach is that we come from different progenitors. In this, Adam Smith positioned himself clearly and unambiguously into the monogenistic one. We come all from the same stock. There are no differences among individuals. What changes, though, so the differences in behaviors, is character. And character changes because of the interactions that we have with others. Individuals form themselves through the mirror of society and appreciate different virtues in different environments. So in an agricultural society, there is an appreciation for masculine virtues. In a commercial society, on the other hand, we increase interaction with others, and in particular with other sexes. And so people become more sociable, and we start to appreciate more the social virtues. So the Scots start to think, or think that there is a process of civilization and of feminization. What this means is that we go from savagery and barbarism, which value aggression and strength, to civil and feminine society, where we appreciate sociality and kindness. The problem with femininity is that it may slip into effeminacy. Effeminacy is a problem, especially when you have to defend your country. So a possible solution for this is the introduction or the promotion of agricultural improvements in the highlands of Scotland and gardening in the lowlands, so that you promote agricultural values against the laxity of commerce. Smith stands out in these debates because he actually prefers a professional army. In the same context, we have the Macpherson translation of the Ossian poetry, and that solidifies the Caledonian ideal of men, which is able to combine a martial spirit of agricultural societies with the politeness and civility of commercial society. Commercial society in which there is no slavery and women are treated with respect and with equality. Condemnation of commercial society is often rebutted by the Scots on the ground that commercial society brings the two greatest blessings that man can possess: opulence and freedom. Not just for some, but for all. What this implies is that freedom is also a legal abolition of slavery. And Smith, again, strongly positioned himself in favor of the abolition of slavery and a strong condemnation of slavery, both on a moral ground and on an economic ground. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Kat, Graham, Tom, Craig. It's good to be here. It's good to see old friends, make new friends. We tend to think of Smith's two major works as these somewhat dense, but at the very least extremely learned academic tomes. But a good deal of what Smith was doing, particularly in the second half of his career and in the Wealth of Nations specifically, was work in the public intellectual mode. He'd become very famous by this point. His countenance was, or his counsel was sought, as Craig made clear. And so when we think about the Wealth of Nations, and this is one of the reasons it's so much fun to teach, it's important to keep in mind that it is in part the work of someone who was a public intellectual, that it's a work that's deeply philosophically grounded on the one hand, but also written in a way that would be understandable and appeal to a broad audience, even if a lot of that audience didn't necessarily wish to accept its message. The simple language, the simple stories, think about the pin factory, the number of hatters in a street. Today it'd probably be the number of Starbucks or coffee shops in a street, since we have so few hatters anymore. These were things that people encountered in their everyday life, that they could relate to and begin to grasp the sophisticated message that underlay all of that. Because Smith wanted to tell a story about the progress of civilization, and importantly, for our purposes, or for my purposes at least as an economist, the economic aspect of that. So he's attempting in the Wealth of Nations to develop and to explain a system, and we've talked a bit about system already, but also to explain the implications of that system. Smith's basically loading up the gun, so to speak, in the first couple of books of the Wealth of Nations, developing that system, then tells some nice historical stories, but then lets his ammunition loose on his unsuspecting mercantilist and other readers in book 4. It becomes very polemical, drawing lessons for policy from that nice and simple system that he'd built up along the way. And so how does this relate to the time? But he's writing for the people of the time. When governance in Britain was very much in the hands of the mercantile and the agricultural classes. The working class, which is the great mass of both the producing and perhaps more importantly for Smith at least, the consuming agents, had no representation. They had no voice. And Smith became their voice. And that's probably one of the most important lessons one can take from the Wealth of Nations is Smith as the voice of the great mass of consumers. And even the working class, rather than the businessman as so often ascribed to him. And so he goes to great lengths to describe both what he considered at least the problematics of the feudal system, the commercial system, the mercantile system. And at the heart of that, in my estimation at least, was his opposition to, one might even say, hatred of monopoly. But more importantly, his tremendous nose for sniffing it out. He even went so far as to lobby his good friend William Cullen, who was professor of medicine in Edinburgh, against a proposal by the Royal College of Physicians to stipulate that medical degrees should only be awarded to individuals who had spent 2 years at university. That is, he didn't think even 2 years of university education was necessary to be able to practice medicine. There's interesting echoes of that in Milton Friedman's later proposal to abolish medical licensure, but we don't need to go there. But Smith's book then is very much concerned about how are economic relations governed. Are they to be governed by the few, as they were at the time, by powerful agricultural and mercantile interests, or were they to be governed by the many? And it matters that Smith was working and living in a sophisticated commercial environment at that time, or at least historically for that moment, sophisticated, where the masses were becoming increasingly involved in commercial society. His concerns about the state, which are well documented, and there's ample evidence from the histories of the period that his concerns about his suspicions of legislators and so on were well justified, were very much what one might call an information problem. His references to things like the folly of the statesman, the legislator who thinks that he has information enough to direct people how to employ their private capitals are reflective of that. For Smith, the interests of the collective are revealed not through the actions of the legislator and the pressures under which he's been put, but through the wisdom of the collective. And for Smith, the marketplace, I think, was one manifestation of that collective wisdom. The legislature were the voices of only a certain and limited set of groups was not. So he wasn't a man of politics or party so much as he was a pragmatic and public-spirited sort of public intellectual. He was even optimistic about the possibilities of an enlightened political process, and in fact was criticized by a University of Chicago economist and self-proclaimed Adam Smith's best friend, George Stigler, for that optimism about the possibilities of the state. Okay? But when you look at things in this way, it helps us to understand that the Adam Smith of Glasgow was not the laissez-faire economist that he's sometimes painted as being, at least not in any extreme sense. A proponent of a good Scot, a proponent of individual liberty, yes, but with bumpers. When I tell the students about this, I like to give the bowling alley for little children example with the bumpers on each side of the lane so the ball doesn't roll into the gutter. That there are these bumpers that are illegal, moral, habits, customs, education, all those things that help steer things in a right direction and promote human and societal flourishing. Think back to the Arab bank crash in Scotland in the early 1770s, due to in no small part to very large but highly speculative loans that were made by people looking to cash in on the booming economy of that period, and in which Smith's patron, ironically, the Duke of Buccleuch, had lost a good deal of money. We don't know that this stimulated Smith's recommendation for legal limits on interest rates, but it makes for an interesting contrast for how the present-day economist, in response to a financial crash of, say, 15 years ago, looked at the question of the need for regulation of financial markets. One last thing about this. One of the great aspects of The Wealth of Nations is that anybody can read it and take if you can read The Wealth of Nations and learn from it. Ironically, it may be that public intellectual aspect of the book that has given rise to the large number of Adam Smiths that are walking around in the economics literature. The great economist Jacob Viner said, you have to have very peculiar views indeed not to find things in The Wealth of Nations that will support your own purposes. And I think perhaps in part in being that public intellectual and writing for that broader audience, Smith may have unwittingly created some of the confusion that perplexes economists today. Thank you.
Thank you all. I wanted to pick up on one of the last points that Steve made there in terms of how ideas are picked up or perhaps overlooked, and we obviously know that that's altered over the time. During Smith's time, was there any particular ideas that would have carried immediate currency within the local and national or even international discussions that were happening? And likewise, were there any of his ideas or key aspects of his thinking that were overlooked or ignored at the time of his life? Please feel free for anyone to take that.
Well, I'll just say that Professor Irwin, who people will hear from later, has made a career out of the fact that people haven't paid a whole lot of attention, or as much as they should, to Smith's ideas on free trade. Maybe we're better off than we were now, or better off now than they were then, but this remains an ongoing battle.
And of the time of Smith, what kind of key ideas would have been picked up or overlooked? Maria.
Maybe I can give a little, try to answer on one aspect at least. The Wealth of Nations was published in March 1776, and there was a lot of expectation about its release because of the views that Adam Smith had on the empire. People wanted to know what he thought about the colonies and about the British Empire. And his views were very much in the news, in a sense, given that a few months later there was a declaration of independence from the North American colonies. That was something that definitely was of interest at the time and not overlooked at the time.
One of the things that Mary said that is quite important is that following the 1707 Union, the economic growth of Scotland was quite disappointing. That's both right and important. And it's useful to put that in the context of what Smith was doing. The project of the Wealth of Nations was in part to try to deliver on the hope that Scotland could rise up to a standard of living comparable to what the English had. That was the hope of the 1707 Union. And the fact that these hopes were disappointed for quite a long time turned out to be very important. I'm guessing that Scottish history right down through 1745 was influenced by the fact that people were highly disappointed in where they were with the union with what had now become these Hanoverians. And so the understanding of the wealth of nations was, yes, it is possible to take actions which will raise the standard of living of the population as a whole. Smith went on about how you can't have a successful country where the great majority of people are poor and miserable. Well, he thought it wasn't necessary that the great majority be poor and miserable, and therefore the book was a kind of how to do it. It was a recipe book. He described it as an assault on the mercantile system, which he meant not commerce, he meant the system of top-down, let's grant government monopolies. And I think all this was very resonant with the time, and it was speaking to what was a clearly on people's minds, and you see it in the politics, but you also see it in the economic thinking. It was, yes, it's possible to raise this group of people up to the standard of living of that group of people. Now, how do we do that?
Thank you. You mentioned empire, Maria, and I think that kind of undercut a lot of what was being discussed here. To what extent was Smith writing? Is Smith writing the work of or against empire?
So Ben just mentioned that the wealth of the nation was defined by Smith himself as a violent attack against the mercantile system. And for Smith, the mercantile system was empire. The empire was created by the merchants to increase their profit at the expense of everybody else. So Smith was violently, as he says, against the empire. And his suggestion was either to let the colony go or to incorporate them, just like the union between England and Scotland. So England and Scotland would now incorporate also all the colonies from North America, India, and Ireland as well. As an alternative, he said, you will face war, and you will lose a war.
Well, one other thing, Smith turned out to be Smith was very much in favor of what became the single biggest event in the British Empire within his lifetime, namely the fact that a whole bunch of us sitting on this stage are not part of the British Empire. That happened in his lifetime, and he was in favor of that. He thought in part on economic grounds, but in part on grounds of liberty, that it was just implausible that what would grow up on the North American continent would continue indefinitely to be part of the British Empire, and for that reason he favored American independence. He thought the British were on the wrong side of the war. They should just take the best deal they could and get out. It was too bad that the American independence movement came up when it did. Maybe they could have gotten another 50 years out of it, but it came up what they did. They should have taken the clue and get out. So at least from the perspective of Americans looking from outside today at the British Empire, this was the big deal event, and historically he was on the right side of it.
I would add to that, in addition to his very vociferous championing of American independence, another place that we see his anti-imperialism come out is in his position on the slave trade. And Smith was a very explicit critic of the lack of utility of slave labor, and also in the Theory of Moral Sentiments in several very charged passages, a great critic of what he calls the sordid souls of the European masters that could barely appreciate the quote-unquote heroism and magnanimity of the native Africans they were enslaving. And so I think this is a very important part, not just of his positions on contemporary geopolitics relative to the American colonies, but also more broadly, his hope that through commercial progress, ultimately some of the more, the really drastically terrible areas of imperialism might begin to fade away.
I wanted to. Oh, Mary, yeah.
Doesn't it see? There's a sort of tension, it seems to me, between the arguments that the commercial society is going to thrive best when you have free trade, but you're living in a world full of empires. So if you create a large empire, you have free trade within it. But if you then decide you don't want to have an empire, you're in a small country in a set of empires in which you're not part of a free trade system. So there seems to me there's always this kind of tension about, okay, it's just writing about the wealth of nations as if we're all in the same position historically and politically, when in fact that wasn't the case. So that's always for me an interesting problem as to how you were going to overcome that in the longer run.
Thank you, Mary. I wanted to pick up on the aspect that you mentioned in terms of the public science that would have been happening at the time in Glasgow, and also the particular locale that Ryan was talking about. Now, Maria said, the club societies would have been a key form of exchange for ideas and information, and perhaps even gossip about what was happening in the city at the time. But what were the other spaces where Smith would have been witnessing or spectating about what was actually happening in the particular locales in which he was living?
That's what's so interesting to me is so many of his accounts are they don't feel quite like real observations. They are observations, but I kind of struggle to see actually. Well, I'm here in Glasgow, and it's this street and that street, and so it's a sort of slightly opaquely observations on. They're not general. I mean, they're sort of specific, but still, I'm not sure. I'm not sure he quite lived here, in some sense. But I'm not sure that Craig probably disagrees with that. I'm not a Smith specialist, nor am I a Scottish specialist. So I'm sure there are people here who know a lot more about all this than I do. It's just my sense of reading this stuff is sort of slight floatingness. Yeah.
So. I had the pleasure on Thursday of spending the day in Kirkcaldy, which I hadn't been back to for many years. I was there 23 years ago on my honeymoon, which is not something many Americans, I think, would say. My wife is still with me, I think, happily. But one of the things I did when I was in Kirkcaldy was do the walk back and forth between the old Kirk and where Smith's house was, on the high street now. And what's remarkable were two facts about that. One is the degree to which, the Longton, forgive my Scottish accent there, but he could not have not interacted with the ordinary citizens of Kirkcaldy day in and day out. But at the same time, when we actually get the glimpses of what Smith was doing when he was there, I sort of, my own homage to Smith was to, he wrote a beautiful letter to Hume where he talks about the long solitary walks along the seaside where he's felt never so happy in his life. And so as I was doing that walk, I was realizing that Smith does have these times when he's occupying civic spaces and he's very much with people, but there's this other undeniably solitary side. There's a side of withdrawal to the man that also very much wanted to be, I think, alone with his thoughts. And I think that sort of dialectical engagement, moving back and forth between public spaces, then back into his conscience. I think we see that both in his biography as well as it's a very important part of the moral theory, of the theory of moral sentiments.
Anyone
Smith was, as Ryan mentioned, both solitary and extremely social. My understanding of his purchasing of Palmer House in Edinburgh, because it's a very big house for a single man. Granted, he lived with his mom and some other relatives, but nevertheless, it's a fairly large house. And my understanding is that he would entertain regularly. So there is the club culture, there is a university, there is also the people that come and visit and are hosted by Smith himself. So there's a constant interaction with others with some pauses for solitary thinking. The university played a major role as well, differently from other places in Europe. Universities in Scotland were very active intellectually, things that in other parts of Europe at the time were not necessarily the case. So I think he managed to get stimuli from basically all aspects of his life.
I'm very aware of hijacking the whole day with our discussion, but I'd like to spend the last period by turning to the floor for questions and comments and reflections, and there's a roving mic. So we have one question, if you just go back the way, I think the first question was up at the back here, sorry, I think there's the first question, and then we have one here, one here, one here. Thank you.
Thank you. Working? Yes. Thank you all for a very interesting panel. I think the question's more on Ryan, and Mary touched on it. What about a counterfactual, like how we've talked about why Glasgow, but if he was just from Glasgow, maybe you'd think he'd get in a little bit on the nice mercantilist grift, so to speak. And what do you think the influences of his upbringing in Kirkcaldy and maybe his later travels were on the critique of mercantilism?
Yeah, very briefly, he was very fortunate to have this extraordinary education before he came to the university in his borough school in Kirkcaldy, in which I was reminded by Craig as we were walking around Kirkcaldy. Not only did he have this wonderful teacher, but he also had classmates that were rather well distinguished. Among the number of classmates there, Robert Adam, the great architect, the man who went on to chair the session, Oswald. I mean, these are really some remarkable people that he would have had engagement with. So all throughout his life, we find him moving in these different circles. And so we can't say it's simply the Kirkcaldy atmosphere. But I think also, I think growing up in a small town probably had some profound influence on him. I mean, I sometimes imagine what it would have been like for the 14-year-old boy to have gone from this small, intimate society. I don't know all of the population numbers, but I think Kirkcaldy was in the 1750s, it was around 2,300. So right around, that's a pretty intimate atmosphere. And for him to go from a society in which everyone knows your name to the relative anonymity of a larger place, I think this too must have had an effect on him. So I do sometimes wonder, when you say counterfactual, what it would have been like had he stayed closer to home or even stayed in Edinburgh, which might have been seen as the more sensible choice for a young man from the East for going to college. So I think that might be one way in which, the counterfactual is actually a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think Mark Skousen, Chapman University. I think it was Professor Medema who mentioned Adam Smith's model, the actual name he used, System of Natural Liberty, and one time Perfect Liberty, I think. So my question is, of all the choices of titles, System of Natural Liberty, he chose liberty as the ideal, the highest ideal, perhaps. He didn't call it the system of natural equality. He didn't call it the system of social justice. He said natural liberty. So to what extent is natural liberty his ideal? And what does he mean by natural liberty as opposed to just liberty?
Steve, would you like to?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question for you. As with Smith's going to have a lot of questions to answer when we get to the afterlife. because I think we run some risk probably in putting definitions of the term liberty circa 2023 into Smith's mouth. The idea of the ability to act in ways one wants to, but also with Smith, a recognition, which you see in later commentators such as Mill, that liberty has two sides to it. That your liberty to do something exposes other people to the exercise of that liberty. And I think this goes to the bumpers I'm talking about. And I think that Smith is cognizant of that. Some of the stuff that we today call externalities in modern economics. I'm not talking about pollution and that kind of thing. I'm talking about individuals' pursuit of self-interest has ramifications for others. And so I think we have to read terms like that in terms of the bumpers, that we shouldn't do what George Stigler did and say that the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations have nothing to do with each other. I'll stop there because other people should have some things to say. It's a complicated.
Ben.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Steve said, that we have to be careful about these words that not only have changed over time, but in our era have become very charged, among which is liberty. And what strikes me, in the vein of what Steve just said, is that Smith did not regard the market mechanism as some kind of hothouse flower that was so delicate it needed to be protected against all possible encroachments. Many people think of Smith as that, in that way today. Smith rather was impressed by how robust the market mechanism was. And he talks about, there's this wonderful phrase, and he says, in which the market mechanism is able to override 100 impertinent obstacles. And he was quite willing to favor what we today would regard as, what we economists today would regard as impedimenta to the market mechanism, and what some people would interpret as violations of liberty. I wouldn't, but I know there are people who do. I mean, for example, he was in favor of progressive income taxes. He was in favor of special taxes on luxury vehicles. Think about in the UK, you have to pay a special tax if you drive a Rolls Royce or a Bentley or a BMW or something like that. And he was very clear that the tax proceeds should just go to relief of the poor. As Steve mentioned, he was in favor of tighter regulations on banking than anything we have seen within our lifetime. Just again and again and again, if there was a public purpose, Smith was in favor of it, even though, of course, he recognized that this was an interference with the market mechanism, and he might have understood that some people would have construed those impedimenta as getting in the way of what some people would call liberty. So I think we have to be very careful about not identifying Smith with the let's defend free markets from every possible encroachment. That just isn't what he was about. He understood the market mechanism, but the conclusion he drew from it was not that it could never be encroached on, but rather that it was so powerful that it could survive very well and do its job anyway. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi. It's an extremely interesting panel, and we ask why Smith, why urban Scotland? But what I don't see in our discussion is an explanation of why Smith, why urban Scotland, why Britain, why Northwestern Europe in comparative perspective. Because after all, there were vigorous commercial societies worldwide. Japan, though closed off under the Tokugawa, was inside a large commercial society. India, in the north especially, was a commercial society. The Ottoman Empire surely was. And there were scientific societies. What the vaunted position in Europe much earlier of the invention of the university, that came from the Arab world. So would any of you want to venture on what the secret sauce was that resulted in this man in so to speak, world historical context?
The secret sauce.
The answer you don't want to hear is they didn't have Adam Smith, right? but I think that's more than a joke, because Smith's genius was the weaving of all of this together and the creation of the system. So anybody who knows the history of economics at all well knows that there are bits and even chunks of everything that's in the wealth of nations in the previous 2,000 or so years of literature. But Smith's genius was to weave it all together in a way that I think resonated, in a way that nothing else at any other place to that point had. My students asked a different version of your question. Well, what's new in Adam Smith? We've been talking about things since Xenophon and the division of labor. What's really new in Adam Smith? And Schumpeter says there's not a whole lot really new in Adam Smith. And the whole is infinitely greater than the sum of the parts. That's what's different, I think.
I would say also that it's the confluence in that time and place of so many of the things that have been mentioned over the last hour. It was the focus on how do you improve the standard of living of the population. It was the intellectual currents. It was the development of the commercial society. It was all of these things coming together in one place. And of course, it wasn't inevitable. You can't add all of these up and say that they were individually necessary and then jointly sufficient. They weren't. So you have to leave room for individual creativity and genius. But I think as I listened, Deirdre, to your array of other possibilities, I don't see in Japan that they had all of these things. I don't see in the Ottomans that they had all of this. There was, after all, the idea of Hume's that the standard of living of the population mattered. This was a new thing. I think it was the Hume essay on which you'll know. Is it the one on the populousness of ancient nations? This was a relatively new thought, and if you had gone back 50, even here, if you'd gone back 50 years before Smith, if somebody had talked about the wealth of nations, they probably would have been talking about the supply of gold and silver bullion sitting in some office someplace. And the whole idea that the wealth of nations didn't mean that, but meant the standard of living of the population. That too is a new thought. So I think, the approach I'd recommend is think of all of these things as individually necessary conditions, and then even all of them together aren't sufficient, and then just as Steve says, then that's where individual genius plays its role.
Yeah, I'd like to try and build quickly on that because I think it's such a wonderful question. Why here? Why here in North Britain was there not just an explosion of opulence, but continued growth? And if I had to try to channel Smith and give his answer, it would be something along the lines of institutions matter as well. For Smith, those remarkable examples, Deirdre, that you mentioned, the other that he comes to again and again is China. And China, he says, was perhaps the most opulent country that the world had ever seen. But yet, as Smith was really obsessed by, China fell in the 17th century, in the end of the Ming Dynasty, at the hands of the Manchu Tartars. Why? Because China did not have many of those institutions. Even though they had opulence, they didn't have precisely the institutions that he defends in Wealth of Nations 5. Educational systems, a military, undoubtedly, as well as institutions of justice that preserve the rule of law and preserve property rights. And these are just profoundly important elements that at Smith, I think the Wealth of Nations 5 puts these out as beautifully as one could ask to try and get to the question of what else is it that made not just, again, the growth, but the continued growth of opulence possible.
Yeah, can I mean,
Yes, please.
I think it's a real problem, right? I mean, the global economic history has completely changed this map of what we think about China and India. So it is really important to think comparatively about that. And on the other hand, it seems to me the kind of arguments could be kind of about Smith and Glasgow could be, well, it's a combination of this elite intellectual, set of people. So it's an input-output kind of explanation. It's the surroundings of the people and their ideas that creates this, or it's some kind of other input-output which is about the economy of the day and how that's kind of creating this account. And I think Steve's answer is a way of kind of going above the input-output accounts on both fronts, which have problems. And I think that there is a valid question remains from Deirdre about, well, actually, now we know what we know about China and India, we have got to rethink this one.
So Scotland at the beginning of the 1700 was not the same as at the end of the 1700. And it went from being like a very poor country to being a very strong center of commerce. And if you think of how Smith describes the economic growth in the Wealth of Nations, it opens with division of labor and extent of the market. Scotland, with the unification with England, had started to have access to a very large market. And what that implied is that you have now all the possibilities to have more opulence. You start to build the roads, you start to build canals, you start to build all the infrastructure that allows you to have more commerce, more opulence, and a very, very strong economic growth. And at the same time, you have the development of the banking system that supports the entire commercial system. So you have the infrastructure, and on top of it, you have the universities, you have the clubs, you have the intellectual freedom that you don't have in other parts of Europe. So the combination of everything and the presence of the genius of Adam Smith, but it's not the only one, right? There are many other geniuses at the same time as Smith. Not just Smith is famous for economics, but you have the father of geology is here, right? So you have great medical doctors in Scotland at the time. They're the best doctors in the world. So you have a lot of things that are going on, and it just happens, I think, because of the combination of all things together. And Smith by himself in rural France most likely would not have been the same Adam Smith that was present instead in Scotland.
We have time for one more question up at the back, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Robbie Mockery from Heriot-Watt University. Our maths department is housed in the Colin Maclaurin building, and I think that it's actually relevant for our discussion that Maclaurin died after the 1745 rebellion because of the efforts. He was exhausted by his efforts in organising the defence of Edinburgh against the Jacobites. Now, that, I think, actually is an important event which brings together science and history in Scotland at that time. But I'm going to perhaps ask a slight variation on Professor McCloskey's question. I've been listening to you talking, and there are many, many things about Scotland at that time which I think we've missed out. What do you think might be the important things? The last thing, if there was one more thing you could say about Scotland in the 18th century, what would it be?
The weather that keeps everyone...
I was going to say golf.
keeps everyone really focused on doing good things inside. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be serious, but I mean, Clorian McClurin was, is one of the people I think is really kind of interesting in this story, the account I was giving. So it's not against the question, but.
Ben?
Isn't it the quality of the universities?
Surely, education.
Yeah.
Patronage. It's all patronage, yeah.
I think we could have a ballot
Education
box on
plus
this
patronage.
at lunchtime, a straw poll. I mean, it's fantastic. Just in closing, I was asked, we've had a great team organising this series of events, and one of them actually asked me when we were doing the late night working on this, they asked if Smith were witnessing or spectating what we were doing here today, and saw us commemorating and celebrating in this way. What do you imagine, thinking about Smith the man, what do you think he would imagine he would be thinking about it?
Personally, I suspect he'd be blushing. One of his late letters, one of his correspondents asks him for how he's doing, and he says something like, I won't say anything more because it's that worst of all subjects, oneself. So I think Smith himself, I think he would have been delighted if we were celebrating his books and ideas. But the man himself was a private man in many ways.
I think he would have been delighted at the idea of a conversation. There's this passage in which he talks about his Stoic image of happiness from his training in Stoic philosophy, but then he goes on to talks about how it's tranquility, but he then goes on to make clear that it's not the tranquility of somebody sitting in isolation. It's conversation. It's comradeship. You can see that he was a clubbable man, and I think the idea that we would have been celebrating his ideas by having a conversation about them would have appealed to him.
And really goes back to Maria's point of this thinking together as a social activity, and you've been wonderful companions in this panel. So I'd like to thank you all, and could I thank the audience as well, joining me to thank each of our guests. Thank you. Thank you.